You are listening to Mining Stock Education, where you'll learn from the top leaders in the natural resource sector and uncover quality mining investment opportunities.
Hi guys, this is Brian Lenny of Mining Stock Education and Junior Stock of Your Premium. Today with me, I have Matt Fernley of Battery Materials Review. Matt, welcome to the show. Because you're new, I think it's best if we start with an intro to yourself and to your newsletter.
Sure. Well, thanks very much, Brian. Thanks for the invite. I'm really pleased to be here and looking forward to seeing what we end up talking about. But my background, I'm a geochemist. I've been a sell-side analyst and a buy-side analyst for 20 years, probably don't want to admit that, but doing various things. And around about 2017, I got very interested in the EV story and the battery story, did a deep dive analysis on that and decided that there was going to be a huge event there. And that there's probably going to be a shortage of battery raw materials. So I set up my business, Battery Materials Review, then, and been doing it for 5 or 6 years now. It's good fun. It's sort of, and I think our subscribers find it useful as well. So it's a monthly subscription periodical focusing on not just the materials themselves, but also the downstream, because I think it's really important that people understand what the drivers are, and that helps to be able to pick the cycles in the materials as well. So we talk about the upstream and the downstream. We focus on the exploration side, the development side, of all the different sort of key battery materials and going into the sort of cathode and the anode stuff. So it's fascinating. It always keeps me on my feet. There's always new sort of questions to ask and thematics to look at. So it's very good. And most of our stuff is subscription, but I do a fair amount of sort of blogs on LinkedIn and various other things. And we've actually got our 2022 yearbook just came out. And it's on our site, available for free at batterymaterialsreview.com. So I've got the ubiquitous advert out the way. I'll try and answer your questions now.
Yeah, well, that's excellent. So I think when most people think about batteries, or especially battery demand, the focus goes to EVs. But I wanted to stay kind of high level, or start high level. And could you first break down to us how the battery demand market actually works by segment of demand?
Yes, I mean, I think if you were looking at this sector sort of 6 or 7 years ago, rechargeable battery demand was dominated by consumer batteries. So stuff like sort of iPod and cell phone batteries, that was really the driver of demand. And then sort of, I guess probably around about sort of 2018, 2019, the EV story started coming to the fore in a big way. And that's dominating demand now and will continue to dominate demand for the next 10, 15, 20 odd years. But we also have another high growth segment coming through, and that's the stationary energy storage segment. So those are the sort of batteries that sit alongside renewable plants, sit alongside residential solar and commercial solar and things like that. And that's a really very high growth area. Now, it's not going to rival EVs anytime soon, or probably in fact ever, but it is going to go past consumer batteries quite rapidly. And from the point of view of me as a geochemist and us sort of specializing in the industry, it's really interesting because some of the chemistry is exposed to it use very different materials to what you get in your bog standard lithium-ion batteries. So stuff like vanadium and chromium and iron and other stuff like that. That's really interesting.
Excellent. Okay. So let's start with the EV batteries. And you kind of alluded to it. There's a number of different chemistries. So could you break down for us how the different chemistries work in terms of demand and sort of the high level with the percentage?
Yeah.
Like that
I'm going to use you as my guinea pig. If your eyes start getting glazed, I'll stop and we can go on to the next question. But yeah, I mean, it's very much a sort of story of over time. In the old days when electric vehicles first broke out, the sort of chemistry was what we call lithium cobalt oxide, which is now the core chemistry for consumer batteries, very cobalt rich. And of course, then the big cobalt squeeze came and people started thinking, well, we've got to start looking at other sort of formulations. And one of the formulations they looked at was lithium iron phosphate, LFP. And they kind of rejected that because it hasn't got very high energy density. So they then moved on to ternary batteries, which at the time were nickel, cobalt, manganese batteries, about a third. And as sort of technology moved forward, they started looking at higher nickel and lower cobalt, because cobalt was very expensive. So the idea was to sort of engineer out the cobalt to any great degree. And in fact, Tesla, who, as we all know, were some of the leaders, they used a type of ternary battery which didn't really use manganese to the same extent, which we call an NCA battery, nickel, cobalt, aluminium. But that's still a quite a small sort of subset of ternary. So now the biggest battery in the world, I would say, is the NCM 523. So that's nickel, cobalt, manganese in 50, 20, 30% increments. But the fastest growing battery within the ternary space is the NCM 811, which is what we call a high nickel battery. Now, the reason that's important, and I'm sure we'll touch on that later, is you can only use a certain type of lithium chemical to make those high nickel batteries. I'm sure we come back to that later. But so that's relevant. And then round about sort of 2020, 2021, you saw the Chinese specifically doing a lot of work on the LFP battery chemistry. And for instance, BYD and CATL, BYD actually brought through this very interesting technology called the blade battery, which completely revolutionized LFP and made it more energy dense within a pack solution. So you now have a situation whereby LFP has been the fastest growing cell chemistry in China for the last 18 months or so. And it's now surpassed ternary batteries. And a lot of people, including myself, expect LFP to be a core chemistry in Europe. Possibly not to the same extent in North America, because your average driving distances are larger in North America. And therefore you need a slightly more energy dense battery. But in Asia and Europe, where your average driving distance may be only 20 to 30 kilometers a day, you don't need a huge battery. So you can have smaller batteries that are less energy dense and therefore cheaper. So LFP has been a huge growth area. It was dead and buried 5 years ago. Nobody was looking at LFP at all. Now it's probably 40% of battery demand. So yeah, that's chemistries in a nutshell.
Okay, can I ask you a question? Like, just going, because that's actually where I wanted to ask you eventually, was talking about that balance between range and energy density and maybe even cost, because I definitely see your point about average travel distances, but I wonder in this inflationary period going forward whether cost becomes a bigger and bigger part of the equation, and where you think the market is headed, because the LFP comes, as far as I know, at a slightly lower cost than the NMC.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I mean, for me, if you listen to Elon over the last 5 or 6 years, it's always been about range. But the problem is range means either ternary batteries, which are more expensive, or bigger batteries, which are more expensive, and also use more material in an environment where materials are very scarce. So for me, we actually now, over the last 6 to 12 months, are starting to see price elasticity in the industry in a way we haven't seen it before. And my feeling is that we will actually start to see pressure on manufacturers to put smaller batteries into the vehicles going forward, and also, cheaper batteries. And that's where LFP, is going to really take over, because a lot of people see LFP as kind of a mass market battery. I mean, if you look at the sort of average battery size in China, it rose enormously in 2018, 2019 with the advent of the Model 3. And then it's absolutely collapsed in a peak. So it's gone from about 60 kilowatt hours to about 40 kilowatt hours over the last 2 years. And that's really been as the small EVs have dominated. And these small EVs sell for about $10,000 to $15,000 and have a range of probably 100, 150 miles, which is fine for the Chinese and for the Europeans, because it's very rare that you would drive more than 100 miles in a day. But in a North American context, it's not so great. But definitely we are seeing an increasing amount of price elasticity, and we're seeing pressure on manufacturers now to start using more efficient batteries. And it's one of the reasons why you've probably seen things like the Cybertruck and the Tesla Semi being delayed, primarily because there was a shortage of raw materials, but also because raw material prices went so high. And now if you look at the battery cost of those units, it's going to be very, very high compared to the rest of the costs in the vehicle.
Absolutely. So, that brings up another point. The Cybertruck or the Semi, I think, are really interesting topics because as you get bigger, or that, weight to power ratio becomes that more important or applicable, it seems that, like, do you think that you were going to see batteries in heavy equipment? Is that something we're going to see in the future? Because I know Caterpillar has moved, or they actually have a line of, the hydrogen fuel cells. But will we see electric vehicles or electric, heavy equipment?
Well, I think this is a really interesting question, and without sitting on the fence, I don't really have an answer for your question, but I'll give you my view, which is that I think you could go up to buses with batteries, and if the raw material shortage drops off, improves over the next 5 or 10 years, I think you can get up to, maybe vehicles the size of the Tesla Semi. But larger vehicles than that, there isn't really the power to weight trade-off. And you're right that a lot of the heavy equipment manufacturers started looking at hydrogen fuel cells. Now, a lot of them have actually rejected hydrogen fuel cells because the efficiency doesn't work. But JCB did a big analysis on this, and they concluded actually burning hydrogen as a fuel was a viable solution for them. So I don't think you've heard the last of hydrogen, particularly in these large vehicles. But, certainly with the cost of raw materials at the moment in the battery space, I'm not convinced that, batteries work for very heavy vehicles. Now, obviously, there are chemistries that would work. So, you talk about new battery technologies, people talk about solid state a lot, which is got a very, very high energy density. But the problem is people have been talking about solid state as the thing around the corner for the last sort of 8 or 9 years, and it's never really arrived. So, solid state could solve the problems, but when?
Right. And so with the solid state, it is an interesting segment of the market because was it energy density, or is it also safety that's been the primary push towards having a solid state battery?
It's energy density. There is a safety issue, particularly for higher nickel ternary batteries, but in fact, LFP batteries are very stable and quite safe compared to ternary. So, there is a safety issue, and there has been, there has to be a lot of focus on the purity of the cathode material, the anode material, the separator, the electrolyte. Generally, when you have instability in cells, it comes back to impurities in the chemical constituents of the cathode and anode and the rest of the cell. So that's why there's this focus on sort of purity, and it comes back to this issue of why it's so difficult to get new supply in place. But really, coming back to solid state, the focus is on energy density. The energy density is so much higher than anything else in the market at the moment. But the problem is, getting into commercial production on that. And also, a lot of solid state batteries, they still use lithium. So with lithium prices this high, how economic is solid state going to be is a big question.
Right. Okay. So maybe this is a good opportunity to go back to that 811 chemistry and how that progression affects the market in terms of maybe lithium or whatever else becomes a bigger deal in that type of chemistry.
Yeah. So I think the real factor on the high nickel chemistries is they use a different type of lithium compound. So your LFP battery and your low nickel batteries use a material called lithium carbonate, which is the primary product from brine operations, for instance, in Latin America. And your high nickel batteries, you use lithium hydroxide. Now, lithium hydroxide can be made two ways. First of all, by converting lithium carbonate, but obviously then you've got the cost of buying the lithium carbonate plus the conversion cost. And then the other way is by processing spodumene concentrate material, and that goes directly to lithium hydroxide. So you do have this two-tier market effectively springing up, and from the point of view of lithium, that makes it even more complex than it would be otherwise. So it's a very interesting, there's lots of sort of moving parts in this market that you don't necessarily sort of see from outside it.
Right. Well, then it's interesting, like, speaking of that, the Chinese have been one of the primary buyers or consolidators of the salars in South America. So I guess it makes sense that there may be the leading consumer of LFP or producer of LFP. It makes a lot of sense.
And also, I think you had I think the big move in the lithium market last year was a number of investment banks cited the growth in lepidolite production out of China. So lepidolite is a lithium mineral that's found in hard rocks, similar to spodumene, which is also found in hard rocks. And processing lepidolite generally goes to lithium carbonate as well. So there was a lot of excitement, or the inverse of excitement, about the fact that China had these resources of lepidolite and they would bring them into production very quickly and therefore created a lithium market. In practice, that hasn't quite happened, but yeah.
So there's a couple different ways I want to go with this, but before I get into the kind of the security of supply, I wanted to ask you a question about hybrid versus plug-in. We saw the Toyota CEO talk about, Toyota's way forward and how they were kind of skeptical on, these fully plug-in, fully plug-in market, and how the hybrid offered, flexibility not only to the manufacturer, but also to the consumer, being the car consumer. So where do you see that market heading? Like, are we going to have to bridge the gap with hybrids in the short term, or how do you see that progressing to maybe to a full plug-in fleet of vehicles worldwide?
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't rate hybrids as electric vehicles.
Okay.
I mean, they're effectively gasoline vehicles with a bit of a range extender.
Yeah.
So I don't. I mean, the legacy for the Japanese OEMs is that they didn't really believe in electric vehicles, and they developed these hybrids, which are very, very complex, by the way. I mean, you've basically got an electric drive engine and a gasoline drive engine. So they're awfully complex. You use a lot of materials, and they're very, very intensive. So I don't think the hybrid is a great solution. Now, the plug-in hybrid, I think, is a very useful middle ground, if you will, between full gasoline and full battery. The plug-in hybrid ticks a lot of boxes insofar as the batteries are much smaller. They're about sort of 15 or 20 kilowatt hours versus, the average battery size for a full battery electric vehicle, which is about probably 50 to 60 kilowatt hours. And they would tick a lot of boxes in the current environment where supplies of material constrained. The only problem is, to a lot of governments, they're not politically acceptable because they still rely on gasoline. So it's a real issue for people in the industry. Will like the idea of the plug-in hybrid because it bridges the gap. But for politicians who perhaps don't understand the pressure on raw materials, they're trying to get rid of plug-in hybrids and make it all battery electric vehicles.
Right. Well, it's also kind of interesting, the political spin on it, right? Because the EVs, they don't emit carbon when they're driving, but that electricity that's produced that still comes from a natural gas power plant. It's kind of just where you put the carbon.
I mean, in some parts of the world, for instance, in China, it's 80% of electricity comes from coal. So Germany, for instance, where a lot of the power comes from really dirty brown coal. You compare that to the UK, where many days in the summer, all of the power comes from renewable energy. It's a very different situation. So if you're running your EV in Quebec, for instance, and you've got 80% hydroelectric power, it's very clean. But if you're running it in certain other states where you've got 80% gas and coal,
it's no difference.
It's pretty much in the eye of the beholder, very much. But the view is that over time we'll move to cleaner energy, and therefore that EVs will be cleaner. And I think the other thing to be aware of in EV land, particularly with regards to the battery, that a lot of people aren't aware of, is that the smelting and processing that goes into the battery is very power intensive as well. So you're making things like cobalt, nickel, purification, cathode manufacturing. All of that is really power intensive. So if you're doing that in China using a grid that's 80% powered by coal, it's pretty dirty. And that's one of the things that a lot of the EV non-believers beat the EV space up about. That you've got this starting level whereby if you buy an EV now or you buy an ICE, your IC's actually got a lower carbon footprint than your EV. It's only if you run it for like 5 or 10 years that the carbon footprint improves. But now, one of the reasons I'm so excited about, developments in the sector in 2022 is with the IRA and this emergence of new clusters of battery manufacturing in Canada and in the US as well. We have the potential to significantly lower the carbon footprint of the manufacture of these vehicles. I'm sure we'll come back to North America later, but I just wanted to put that one in there.
You bring up an interesting concept because it's definitely somewhere where I wanted to go with the conversation but I think the EU is probably the best example for this question, because I remember reading a couple of years back, the EU set out this kind of broad outline of how they wanted to have a certain carbon footprint for the additives for their batteries. And they said, within this certain segment or a certain range of a battery manufacturing plant, that's where they wanted to get all their material. But I see an issue with something like lithium, because as far as I know anyways, there's not a lot of sources of lithium, or maybe if any, in Europe. And so you have this kind of dichotomy between the political push towards, having your low carbon footprint battery materials, but then you have the real issue with supply. And, with a world that's kind of diverging, this seems to be a bigger and bigger topic.
I kind of liken the European EV industry to like building the Sistine Chapel without putting in the foundations on the building. And that's the problem, because they've got all these great, aims with regards to the EV industry, but they have invested so little in raw materials that Europe's got a serious problem, a very serious problem. And in fact, there are a number of lithium projects in Europe that have been under development for the last 5 years, and they're still under development because they keep getting blocked by environmentalists. And Rio Tinto, which is one of the world's big mining companies, had a big project in Serbia called Jadar, where they dropped in probably 500 or 600 million in investments. And the Serbian government turned around last year and just said, nope, not taking this forward, cancelled, bang. So that there really is a really big issue in Europe with regards to getting raw material projects off the ground. And there's something of an issue in the US as well. But this is why the IRA is so intelligent, because it acknowledges that there's a planning issue with regards to raw material projects in the US. And it says, well, fine, you can source raw materials from other countries where the US has a friendly relationship. We call it friendshoring. So that basically opens up Canada and Australia, and God forbid the UK if it ever got any primary production.
Okay. So the other thing I was reading about is the Critical Raw Materials Act within the EU. And I guess does that address the issue of permitting and maybe necessarily fast tracking some of these projects, when they're discovered or when they're applying?
The answer to your question is not yet. We obviously have some clarification coming through on the European approach within the next 2 weeks. I don't know how long it will take for this podcast to go out, but probably we won't have any clarity before the podcast goes out. But yes, so the European Union is going to publish its strategy over the next couple of weeks. But I mean, I think the problem that the EU struggles with is that basically you've got to have whatever it is, 25 countries agreeing on something. And that's difficult. I mean, that's like herding cats. And I feel upset by what's happened in the EU, because they were the first area to recognize the importance of the battery story and electric vehicles in 2017, 2018. And between then and now, they haven't gone anywhere. And, Australia, Canada, Indonesia, the US have all lapped the EU. And the other thing that's a real issue in the EU is this understanding of ESG and the relationship between ESG and primary raw materials. And, when I speak to European governments, I always get this yada, yada, yada. We're investing in recycling. We don't need to invest in primary production. And you sort of sit there and you go, well, can I ask you some questions? First of all, how long do you think a battery lasts in an EV? I don't really know. I think 10 to 12 years. Next thing, how many times does the industry have to grow? The supply in the industry have to grow over the next 10 to 12 years? I don't know. Oh, think about 7 to 8 times. So you think about, what are the contribution to supply the batteries that we were using 10 to 12 years ago are going to make in 12 years. And it's, they'll be like 5% of supply, providing that they all go, into recycling, and they could go to other uses. They could go to second life uses and whatever. So realistically, by 2020, 2035 or something, we may be recycling enough material to contribute 2 or 3% to supply. It's going to be irrelevant. So you don't invest in the primary raw material now, recycling is not going to be enough. So this is a real issue that we have to deal with in the markets when we talk to politicians, because they like the cute, fluffy, clean things, but they don't really like dirty industry, and mining and chemicals, of course, are dirty industries.
Right. So in your view, what would you say are maybe the top 3 to 5 materials that the EU specifically has to be looking at to fast track to make sure the supply chain is going to work?
So the only battery raw material that is made at any scale in the EU is nickel. So there's a project in Finland, there's a couple of smelters in the Nordic region, and obviously there's Norilsk nickel in Russia as well. Whether that material is going to be acceptable, I don't know, but for the time being it is, in global supply chain. So really the only material that they are balanced, certainly not long, but balanced in, is nickel. Cobalt, manganese, phosphate, lithium, they could be balanced in graphite. There's some interesting graphite projects, particularly in the Nordic region, and integrated graphite projects. So they might get there in graphite, but again, those are in, development. I'm not going to call it development hell, but it could certainly be going a lot faster. Let's put it that way. So they could have graphite and nickel, but basically lithium, cobalt, manganese, and phosphate. They got to put some effort into developing resources in those areas.
So let's move on to grid scale storage, this stationary storage that you were talking about earlier. I think truly to hit the net carbon zero goal by 2050, I think this is going to have to be a major part of that solution. So I was wondering, I guess it's a 2-part question. The first one, are batteries the best way to address the grid scale energy storage? And then secondly, if so, what kind of commercially viable options out there today on the battery side of things?
Okay, so I think talking about the grid scale energy storage. So there's different solutions in the market. I think the first thing to be aware of is that obviously we want to go more renewables. Now, the problem with renewables that not a lot of people are aware of is if you have more than 20% renewable power in your grid, it destabilizes your grid. So you need something to smooth off that power. So there are 2 applications of batteries. There's what we call short duration, so basically power smoothing and frequency modulation and everything. And there's longer duration, which is genuine storage of power over the long run. Now, what we see at the moment is really the only major commercial technology that's in the market is lithium ion. But lithium ion certainly is not, in my view, the best technology for long duration energy storage. There are better ones out there which aren't really produced on a commercial scale at the moment. And then for shorter duration, a lot of people favor other technologies like capacitors and different things like that. But I think lithium ion do have their place, but obviously with the higher power costs now, higher costs of manufacture in lithium ion, it does make lithium ion less competitive with potentially other technologies in the market. So that's the issue that we're dealing with. And then if you look at long duration, some of the technologies I mentioned earlier, vanadium redox flow batteries, they've been around the longest, and there's a lot of potential in that business. But we're still waiting kind of for that gigafactory moment in terms of economies of scale. We're just not seeing anybody really scaling up manufacturing capacity enough for that. Chromium flow, iron flow, sodium ion, which is starting to take off in China. People are looking at that. Again, that's more of a shorter duration technology, and that could, fill in for lithium ion because at the moment it's quite a lot cheaper than lithium ion. So, those are the sort of things that we're looking at. And then at the moment, because there aren't very many long duration technologies in the market, what people do is they double and triple up on lithium ion batteries. So if you need a duration of, say, 8 hours, and your lithium ion battery only has a duration of 2 hours, you just put in 4 banks of lithium ion. But of course, that's 4 lots of batteries. So that's going to cost you 4 times as much. So, these are the issues that we're dealing with in the space. And of course, the other problem is that, you think about investing in a battery over time, a renewable generation over time, the cost of capital is increasing. So, as interest rates go up, it throws the economics of these businesses, which are 10, 15, sometimes 20-year businesses, into flux. So it's a very difficult time, on the stationary storage side. And then on the other side of the equation, where we're talking about stationary storage, maybe alongside solar, for sort of backup generation in places like California, where the grid goes down every so often, and particularly in Europe, where there's a real concern about the ability to source gas from ex-Russia. That's one of the fastest growing areas for residential storage in the world, by the way, in Europe and Eastern Europe. But in these areas, obviously, the cost of lithium-ion batteries is going up, but also, a lot of these things are bought on credit. So obviously, if interest rates are going up, that's going to impact the ability of the consumer to buy these things. So, there's a lot of moving parts in that space at the moment. But, from the point of view of residential of utility scale stationary storage, I think there's a strong growth potential, but we've got to prove that it's viable, really. Yeah.
So if I understand you correctly, the reason for not having as much or mass adoption on the grid scale or utility scale battery storage is because the technology isn't necessarily at the point where people are confident in it. Is that the?
So it's not, the lithium ion is not the best technology for, long duration storage. And then the other technologies, there just isn't the history. There is actually the history in vanadium redox flow batteries. There's one that's been running in Japan for 7, 8, 9 years, I think now. But, people want, it's like with EVs, people want to be able to test these things over a long period of time and make sure, they're not going to stop working just when my customers need their power and stuff like that. So I think that's the real thing. But we are starting to see, a lot of money going into research, a lot of money being allocated to sort of push these things forward. I would say we're probably 12 to 18 months away from large scale commercialization of a lot of these non-lithium ion technologies. So we're just on the cusp of that really taking off as a huge market.
There's a ton of talk on the cathode side of things, but there's not, or at least in my view, there's not a lot of talk on the anode side. I know the anode side is dominated by the graphite, but what can you tell us about the anode side? Maybe even more specifics on graphite and where it kind of stands, you think, in the criticality moving forward?
Yeah, so for me, graphite is one of the areas where I'm most concerned, not so much on the supply of natural graphite side, but on the side of the anode materials, where I can see, if you'll excuse the horrific pun, a big black hole. And there is a complete lack of projects that are going to come through in time outside China in anode materials. So if you look over time, certainly sort of going back to 2017, 2018, the bulk of anode material and batteries was derived from synthetic graphite, artificial graphite. And that was the most consistent product for the battery makers. Now, the problem with artificial graphite is it's generated from basically the oil refining industry. So the input is quite a dirty material. And on top of that, to purify it, you have 2 approaches. One is chemical purification with an acid called hydrofluoric acid, which is really difficult to handle and can generate big environmental impact. And the other way is with thermal purification, which in the synthetic graphite industry requires you to heat it at 2000 degrees for like 2 weeks or something. So as you can imagine, that's quite power intensive. with an associated carbon footprint. And costs of synthetic graphite have been rising quite rapidly because of closures in oil refining, and obviously the cost of power has been increasing. So over the last 4 or 5 years, people have started looking more to natural graphite, and the process of converting natural graphite into anode material basically involves making spherical graphite. And through the processes I talked about earlier, you've got to purify it, you've got to what we call micronize it, and then you've got to turn the flakes of graphite into spheres effectively. And then you've got to coat those materials to use in anodes. And even though the Chinese have been doing this for a while, there aren't any major projects on this in the Western world. There are a lot in development. I think there are 10 or 12 in development. But we basically need all of those 10 or 12 to come into production by 2025 if we're not going to have a big hole. And that's not going to happen. So, we really need a lot of investment in what we call the midstream in the graphite side of things, because, this battery demand is rising so rapidly, but anode material production can't ride with it because synthetic graphite, you won't be able to grow at 30 to 40% a year. Maybe it manages 5 or 10% a year. And then the flake then has to make up for that. And we're just not, opening enough capacity fast enough. So it's a huge area where there's a lot of investment going in. But it's difficult to get these things, like on the mining side, it's difficult to get these things into production. And not, it's not a problem getting them into production to some extent, but pushing the required recovery levels at the required purity on a consistent basis, that's the issue. And the industry has struggled with that historically. So yeah, it's for me, graphite is probably where lithium was 2 or 3 years ago, and I think we're just getting to the point now where graphite prices could tip up quite rapidly, and it's a real issue because you think about what materials you need in a battery: nickel, cobalt, manganese, phosphate, lithium, graphite. Every battery uses lithium graphite. They may use nickel, cobalt, manganese. They may use nickel, cobalt, aluminium as a cathode. They might use lithium iron phosphate as a cathode. Every single battery uses lithium and graphite. So it's a big issue.
Oh, those are great points. So I think, the bullish side of the battery narrative or the net zero narrative, I think is quite clear. And I think almost regardless of where the world is headed, the demand is going to be on the positive side. But I'd like to play devil's advocate and ask you about, the bearish side of things, or maybe the not as rosy bullish side, because I think one of the big things we talked about earlier is cost. And in a higher inflationary environment, I really wonder where the consumer is going to have the money to buy these EVs and buy these different things moving forward. And then you have in the UK, for instance, you've got the 15-minute city concept, and I think that's in Oxford in the UK. And you seemingly have like these two things where the government is pushing towards the use of cleaner technologies, but they're also saying, hey, look, you should be not using your car as much. So I wonder, can you talk about the other side of things on where demand might be constrained because of these other things?
I mean, you touched on a really important point for me, insofar as I think the biggest risk to the energy transition now, whether it's the battery side or whether it's the energy transition as a whole, is this issue of underinvestment in raw materials. Because, as you say, if lithium prices go too high, nickel prices haven't really moved that much in the cycle, cobalt, manganese, graphite prices, for instance, if they go too high, how are we ever going to get price parity on electric vehicles? And, one of the things that's been that's kind of got our fat out of the fire in the EV industry over the last sort of 2 to 3 years is, even though raw material prices have gone up, the industry has done very well in terms of rolling out new technological innovations and economies of scale, which have limited the extent to which battery cell costs have gone up on a dollars per kilowatt hour basis. But you can't keep doing that forever. And, if raw material prices continue to go up over the next few years, then it's really going to be an issue. And I think the only way that you can get around that is by using smaller batteries. So for me, one of the things that I expect to happen as a trend is I think that EV makers going forward will use slightly smaller batteries and potentially will rely much more on fast charging. So just to step back a little bit on charging at the moment, I think people see the sort of, I don't know how it is in North America, but in the UK, we get different types of recharging infrastructure. You get the stuff that sits at the gas station. We have stuff in lampposts in London. Then you have other stuff that sort of sits at the side of the road. Now, those recharging points are actually only where probably 20% of EVs in the UK get recharged. Most EVs get recharged at people's homes overnight. And, that's not a problem. But certainly, if we want to go forward, fast charging becomes important. And if people can't recharge at their homes overnight, and for instance, they don't live in a house, they live in an apartment in a city centre, then there's a lot more pressure. And it's very important then that we can, get a car into an EV charging station and get it out again in 20 minutes. And that's when fast charging becomes very important. So I think fast charging technology is potentially a beneficiary of higher prices, because I think higher raw material prices will eventually result in smaller battery sizes. And smaller battery sizes means that you're going to have to recharge more often, and it might be when you're away from the house. So I think that's the sort of key area. But I would suggest that underinvestment in raw material is now the biggest risk to an energy transition, whether that's batteries or whether it's copper for high voltage cabling or aluminium or anything like that. There's a huge issue out there. And, we're building in not only a structural shortage, but a time shortage as well, because, as the bulk of your listeners probably know, it takes up to about 10 or 12 years to build a new mine from discovery to production. It only takes, 2 to 3 years to build an EV manufacturing facility or a cell manufacturing facility. But we're building in this huge time lag as well as the structural shortage. And I think that that's something that's not being understood by a lot of politicians, by a lot of people in industry. It started to be understood by a number of OEMs. So we had comments out from the CEO of Stellantis, from the CEO of Ford, from LG Chem, the cell manufacturer, in the last sort of 6 months or so. So that's great, but you still got to put your money where your mouth is. Last year, we saw 4 deals, count it, 1, 2, 3, 4 deals, where an OEM actually put capital into a mine developer. 4. We need to be seeing loads of these deals. I mean, last year, record lithium prices, fundraising in the lithium space actually went down 20% year on year. It needs to be going up 20, 30, 40% year on year for the next 5 years. You're just not seeing that sort of investment coming through.
Right.
On my soapbox there.
Yeah. Well, but you bring up a really good point. I live just outside Toronto, the province of Ontario. Each province in Canada has kind of put a different spin on it, but they're projecting no ICE vehicles sales after 2030 or 2035. And I hear something like that, and it's like, whoa, how can you jump to that sort of conclusion, no matter how rosy?
It's a lovely idea, and we wish it could happen, but I'm going to say now it won't happen.
Right.
It can't happen because there's not enough investment in raw materials. And, the EU has these controls as well. A number of US states have announced these targets too. So it's just non-viable in its current form because there's just not enough investment in raw materials.
Okay, so we've talked about the battery side, from supply and demand sort of point of view, but then I want to take it from the point of view of an investor. So in 2023, can you give us what you would say are the top 2 metals that investors need to be looking at in the battery space?
So I'm going to say graphite, and I'm going to stick with lithium. There are, a couple of sort of minor materials. I would definitely say high purity manganese is a really interesting material. But let's go with graphite and lithium as my 2 top picks. Yeah, and lithium prices are going down at the moment, and people are probably staring at the screen going, "What is he smoking? He has no idea what he's talking about." Hopefully, we'll talk about why I'm positive on lithium later.
Yeah, well, and also it's I think you could probably answer this question with so you've got the metals, but then what type of company are you looking at? Like, are you looking at a senior miner? Are you looking at a junior developer? Are you looking at exploration? Where do you think that sweet spot is? Because not all those companies are as exposed to price pressure.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of easy money has been made in this sector already, particularly on the lithium side between the third quarter of 2020 and back end of last year. A lot of stocks are up multi-baggers 9 or 10 times because of the increase in prices. I'm on record in BMR as saying last year I prefer the explorers to the rest of the space. Now, this is in lithium specifically, not so much in graphite, but in lithium, I prefer the explorers. And the reason is because they are generating value at the drill bit. And my gut feeling is that equity markets are going to maintain their, how should we put it nicely, volatility, certainly over the next 3 to 6 months. And in volatile equity markets, you do often find, particularly, at this stage of the cycle, that mining stocks will underperform because they're very high beta and very volatile. In the lithium space, I'm excited about explorers because there's a number of really exciting exploration areas out there where, stocks are adding value, adding resources, basically. And I think in a down market or a weak market, you generally find the explorers outperform because they're able to add new value for investors. And also on top of that, because they're drilling all the time, they're generating news flow. Hopefully positive news flow. Hopefully we made some intercepts rather. I couldn't find anything, but hopefully positive news flow. But I run in BMR. I run baskets, so I average out the performance of various sort of equities in each area, and our lithium explorer basket was the only basket that was in positive territory last year, and I think that says everything you need to know. Yeah.
Excellent. Hey, Matt, I've really enjoyed the conversation. I think we've covered a lot of those high points, but we're definitely going to need to talk again because there's so many other places we can go with this. But I think we're going to leave it at there for today. Matt, how can people follow your work?
So check out my website, batterymaterialsreview.com. It is a subscription product, but there's a fair amount of free stuff on there as well. Check out our yearbook, totally free, tells you what happened in 2022, some thoughts for 2023 as well. So yeah.
Excellent. Sounds good. So we'll talk again. Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much.